Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Today we're going to be looking at 5 of the most recent online tournaments with our eyes on the legal regional championships, which I'm going to be playing in as well. It's just a couple days now for that, so I'm personally locked into a deck choice and I'll talk about the highs and lows in terms of matchups of every choice that we can look at today, but also we're going to hone in on some pretty interesting deck lists, and we start off with this Arceus deck list that is just pure Arc. It is playing some interesting tech cards in the Panic Mask in here. We've seen similar things in the past, like Vengeful Punch and Box and Disaster. Panic Mask is another great way to stay out of range of a KO against Gardevoir players, of course, where they have to self-damage so much that they are then unable to attack into the Panic Mask, which is pretty cool. We're seeing Hammers in here as well. I don't really expect Hammers to be all that powerful right now. We have such insane energy acceleration, so it's a little bit surprising to me to see Hammers do so well. But if Sacramento has taught us anything, it's that the cornerstone of 4 Judge, 4 Path, and just getting into the game with Starbirth and having Barrel Squova as a fallback play, that proves that, yeah, it's viable once again. So I think there could be a small uprising in Arc. Giratina is below 5% in most of these tournaments at the moment, so Arc doesn't have quite as many like awkward matchups. I feel like you're still a little bit worried about Miraidon, and in fairness, Crushing Hammers does help against that matchup. So yeah, it's cool to see the Arc piles coming back, I suppose. Judge Path is just keeping the Stage 2 decks in check. It's keeping Chen Pao in check as well. It feels like there's just enough, well, even Lugia, there's just so many decks that are ability reliant right now that there is a gap in the market for the Arcs, the Mew players, as well as Miraidon players. So these decks find their footing because there's just so many ability-based decks right now in the game. In second place, we have the Lost Zone build of Charizard EX. This, of course, showed up in the Barcelona SPE and hasn't done too much since. But some interesting choices in here. It was just a very thin package of the Charizard, really. Just a 2/0/2 with 2 rare candies. So not taking up a huge amount of space. Is choosing to play an Irida in here to try and maybe cherry pick at least the candy part or the Ultra Ball part if need be. Yeah, giving you a dark type coverage attacker with high damage output late game, but still having the cornerstones of Sablecram and having Greninja in here with those gates. I'm personally a fan of playing gateless with a thicker Zard. That's just how I've playtested the deck a lot more. But it's an adaptation of the Barcelona 60, so still has those same strengths and weaknesses. There's a lot of Charizard around right now, and I actually think this is really good at farming that matchup because you just have much more flexible damage and more single prizes to force an awkward race for the opponents. That I think this does still have some dodge and weaving to do, but it's definitely not in the worst spot in the meta. There was a different type of Arc pile in the top 4. It's Arc with Tapu Koko, V and VMAX, and a 1/1 Flying Pikachu VMAX in here as well. Some more really interesting cards. We have the Leafy Camo Poncho, so people can't gust up your benched V-Star or V-Max. The idea being you're sat there max ballooning, and then you poncho your Pika itself, so it can't be rote bossed. That's kind of the idea. The Tapu Koko provides a paralysis option, as well as continuing to help 2-hit KO stuff. It's pretty bulky in a format where there really aren't that many fighting Pokemon, apart from like Rapid Strike Urshi, so it gets away with things. I'm sure there's also the Ortega jumping out at you as it is with me, forcing your opponent to reveal their hand. You put a card, you find that to the bottom of their deck, and then they get to draw a card. Seems like a really weak supporter effect, but it's like getting an effective Fang Snipe off. And I think the idea is if you're going for a paralysis play, or if you're going for a Max Balloon play, and you Ortega their pivots card out of their hand, then it's going to work a lot better for you, which I think is pretty interesting. Also just allows that path lock to stick a lot more, similar to a Judge Path combination, but there could be situations where if the hand size is already low, you could go for a Starbirth for like Path Ortega and then just completely crumb them from their one supporter in hand that they've held. So yeah, it's a wild list, very disruptive, has 2 league headquarters in here as well to really make it so that people can't simply sprinkle through a Flying Pikachu so easily with Sableye. Yeah, just seems like a very gross, annoying to deal with archetype. And again, just more reinforcement that Arc could be making a comeback. Interestingly enough, with all this Arc hype, there were some Lost Zone Tinas in top 4 and top 8, but they didn't quite convert, even with some potential Arcs in there as well. There was a Snorlax stall, but we have already talked about this before on the channel a couple of times. and there were some other Charizard EXs doing well actually as well. This is playing that slightly thicker line, more similar to what we saw previously with the list. Actually, this is very similar to the Barcelona 4th place list. And then we end on a Radiant Charizard base build similar to the Peoria 60 that made top 8. Kyogre Lost Zone Box was able to take the win in the second late night tournament. It's playing the V package, even playing a Town Store to give you more access to the Forest Hill Stone, and a couple of Bravery Charms in the deck list as well. Possibly this is how the player is trying to even out the sort of mirror match, I suppose, where you're trying to Bravery Charm up your Sableye so they get less value than you in the sort of Sableye versus Sableye showdown. So essentially you just give yourself more floating damage counters. I imagine that's one of the key reasons for it. There could be other applications for Bravery Charm, of course. Pushing some of your V Pokemon out of range could also be quite valuable. Maybe Bravery Charming like Raikou into Colorless Lugia or something gives you a lot of help. So yeah, I can also see that being a reason to like this mini package of Town Store going into a Kyogre-based build, which is something you don't see every day. Andrew Hedrick was able to make top 4, and it's always nice to take a look at their deck lists. Normally he's rocking deck lists that he then just simply takes to tournaments, so it's always nice to see these sorts of things. And interestingly enough, dropping the Raikou from a Turbo Lost box and just having the Dragonite and the Pidge still has the triple Forest Hill Stone, has a third Sableye in here, as well as some of the Rods and Clara, so many ways to reuse your Lost Mine. There's no secret that that's one of the selling points of this archetype. It looks like Andrew's leaning into that a huge amount there. Michael Catron's another player that will have your head scratching. He's loved Arc Piles in the past and has had good IRL tournament results with them. This time we're seeing the 1-1 Rapid Strike Urshifu, the 1-1 Flying Pikachu VMAX, and the 1-1 Alolan Vulpix V-Star, as well as the techs of Spiritomb, of Tempting Trap Mawile, and still has that Radiant Alakazam in there for some sneaky math fixing going on all over the shop. So yeah, in Starbirth we trust. We get the right Pokemon in the right situation. We're going to try and stonewall people with Snow Mirage. Try and just say no with Max Balloon. You have Sharon's Care for healing against Lost Box. Even just attacking with Arceus over and over again is good in that situation. You have Lost Cities to remove threats from play. Yeah, you're just, I don't know. It's a hard deck to decipher, right? It's just a Catron classic where all of them serve different purposes for different matchups, and if you shove enough of them into your deck, you end up having a reasonable matchup spread as long as you can get into the game, and it seems like Starbirth makes that happen enough times that, yeah, you you have so many pitfalls for the opponents throughout the entire match. It's such a wacky deck. We move on to the Kitchen Showdown number 3, where a Miraidon was able to come out on top. Nothing too much to write home about with this deck list, choosing to play Mew EX rather than Squawkabilly, and is going for the full quad path to the peak. Interestingly enough, also going with that sort of higher judge count than Iono counts, just wanting to have the more proactive hand disruption at their disposal, and is playing Quad Ultra Ball. This obviously combines nicely with Mew EX when you are, you know, unlocked from your own path, so that's another thing to bear in mind. Choosing to play 2 Forest over 2 Arven is pretty okay, and yeah, just another couple basics in there. The Zeraora compared to the Flying Pikachu is a bit of a 50-50. And yeah, the Mew versus the Squawk, these are kind of the spaces that are sort of in question right now for Miraidon. A pretty spicy coin flip based Fusion Mew was able to get second, a Silene as well as catchers, so all sorts of coins that you can be flipping. I do like seeing Town Store in the Mew. I feel like it makes sense even with very aggressive builds like this one. It's just a +1 out to Forest Hill Stone, which gets you gaming, and I think for a list as aggressive as this one, definitely does make sense. Also in this top 8, we also saw just another Charizard Lost Box. They seem to have made a bit of a comeback this week in the online scene. Not sure as to why they're playing 60 hit point Charmanders, but outside of that, it's again similar to builds that we've seen in the past. Looks like everyone's enjoying the Water Energy Gates package. That was the first thing that I sort of questioned when I played this deck list myself, but Radiant Greninja does ask questions of all sorts of archetypes, does open up more lines for you, and at the very least Mirage Gate does act as extra pivot options for Confays throughout the sort of mid-game, and it can help you out against Iono situations where you just bank an energy to pay retreat a Confay. So there are some good elements going on here, and Charizard is still a very powerful card. I feel like the Lost Zone build actually gets around the handlock strats that a DTE Mew will try and put on you with their grabbers, their Luxray, that sort of thing. Because if they're Luxraying into a Confay, you still always have Flower Selecting to give yourself 3 cards at the very least to get yourself out of that hole with top deck for turn, plus an Insta-Select, and sometimes you can even bank attachments on the Confay and whatnot and give yourself plenty of draws to just get into your Zard. So you don't get quite as brick-walled as you would playing the Arven Zard, which is much more ability-based. Speaking of Arven Zard, it was able to win the Tournament of Doom this week. See a pretty interesting build from Davi here, adding in a Mute EX. You don't always see this incorporated with Charizard, but of course it can be powered up all in one turn with a Infernal Rain, so it does give you some hacking plays, you know, stealing Greninjas and such can just add extra lines to the archetype. Beyond that, nothing too out of the ordinary here. Also choosing to play the old Charmeleon, I actually think that is the superior one. I know you are losing 10 hit points, which is somewhat of a concern against exactly Lost Box, but being a 2 energy 70 I think is a bigger uptrade than having a 3 energy 90. Just feels like a better number to me for more an efficient attack cost. But also there's a card that's kind of not in the deck that I always question. Vitband just seems to be such a good inclusion in some of the highest placing lists. Do play Vit at the moment, so I would definitely think about adding that into the deck list. It feels like a really valid card. With so many mirrors around as well, being able to hit a Pidgeot for 280 after giving up 3 prize cards can be massive. Easily can be done into other V-Star matchups as well, especially with Arc coming back. That can be more and more relevant. So these are just things that I have in mind, especially because Vitband is also just good into Miraidon and into Chien-Pao anyway. Feels like it's just a no-brainer card to have in the deck these days. We have another interesting Turbo Lost Box from MP with a Luminion in the deck list, rather than, again, the Raikou or the Pidgeot, that sort of thing, giving you just instant access to the Chorus, which is always nice, but you have other one-off supporters in the deck as well. Playing 2 Collapse Stadium as your stadium of choice, allowing you to unlock your board and, of course, get the fish out of play, which is kind of nice. Can also create some really interesting board spaces where you go collapsed into your own vacuum, then open up a space for maybe this Flying Entry or Lucha, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of creative lines that you have going on in this deck list, which I think were worth mentioning. Another tournament, another successful Arc pile. It's made a huge comeback in online tournaments. We have the Flying P once again doing well, but now we see the 2/1/1 Zeraora, V-Star, and V-Max. Let me refresh my memory on what these cards even do. 190 discard a stadium. You never really use the V-Star power because it's too expensive. It has a free retreat cost at least. What does the V-Max do? 60 for each of your opponent's Pokemon that has an ability in play. At least that's doing high damage output in a lot of situations. And I guess Lightning type coverage is just good because it farms Pidgeots, which gives you a better prize race into Charizard. Maybe just being a Lightning type is good into the Charizard matchup, just so you have proactive takeout Pidge plays, and then their deck kind of falls apart. Really interesting to see 1 Ditto in the deck to provide a free retreat option, but also just becomes a 5th Arc, which I guess is kind of cool. And it does have the Hawlucha in here as well. I suppose Zeraora hits only 300, so giving yourself a 310 option with Hawlucha is pretty okay. There may be other situations where that multiplier is helpful for you. We also have Choice Belt in here as well, so a few different ways you can try and math fix your way around that. Still playing good old Judge Path. That's a big part of the win condition. A huge amount of energy in here as well. 9 basic energy, as well as 7 special energy. That's just a huge number of turn 1 attachments that you can gain with the deck, so you're not really whiffing on that too much. So really just trying to play those classic arc ratios to get into the game, and just hope that your Lightning package does the work. There was a Palk Chien-Pao also doing pretty okay. Has the Articuno in here as well for that paralysis option. Does play a couple Iono to try and support that, which is kind of cool. But obviously you're trying to do this paralysis against decks that have kind of few outs anyway at times. So yeah, just another 1 prize Pokemon that you can add into the deck to sort of fix your prize race or just overall buy a turn, which is kind of cool. We end on the Deck Out Mondays, and looks like a lot of Mew domination here with a Mew Mirror in the finals. It was that classic Grabber, Luxray, DTE package that we saw from Rowan a couple of weeks ago now. Continuing to see a lot of success, and tell you what, it is a scary archetype to come up against. It can brick all sorts of archetypes in the game, and the second place list was also playing the Grabber Lux package, so seemed to be a very good choice. There was yet another Arc. How is it happening? Just seems like a flick of the switch and suddenly there's Arc decks all over the online space again. It hasn't taken much for people to restore confidence in this deck. This time it's playing the Leafeon V-Star package to guarantee your turn 1 energy drops from Greening Cells, which is lovely, and it gives you that grass type coverage, of course, into Charizard. We're seeing the 2/2 Liepard to give yourself some extra draw throughout the game, as opposed to a Bibarel, which is kind of interesting. Typically, it's just a card that can thin throughout the game just a little bit more proactively, and is kind of always live. Typically, though, like the value of 1 Bibarel is normally higher than the value of 1 Liepard, but I suppose getting 2 out is kind of okay, especially with the huge amount of ball search that you have in here. I'm sure it does come online a decent amount. Interesting to see the Ditto in here as well, just again, just adding to your let me get an arc into play concepts, which is cool. as well as being a one prize Pokemon when you do go second. It does have that Radiant Greninja for some extra draw in the deck as well. Just so many different ways that Arc has come out in droves over this week. It's really incredible to see so much of it. I know I'm looking for the sort of outlier decks in general, so these videos always end up showing the quirkier stuff, but we seem to have talked about Arc a huge amount this week. It seems to be back on the radar. So let's end the video talking about the trusty Trainer Hill data. You can see I've put Arceus back on the map because it seems like people are happy to play it. Again, it did well in Sacramento and seems to have done very well in all sorts of iterations in the online space this week. There are some glaring bad matchups in Rapid Strike Box and Miraidon Flaffy. Kind of interesting that Arc can sort of choose its poison in terms of what other matchups it wants to be very favoured or very unfavoured against based on maybe the type coverage attacker that you're trying to put into the deck list, or if they are just annoying wall Pokemon to give yourself checkmates in the form of Duraludon or Flying Peak. Stuff like that we've seen over this week. Even the Alolan Vulpix has had a look in from a few players. So yeah, it's going to be this annoying deck that in general is bulky and frustrating for Lost Zone box players. So it has just another archetype to worry about alongside the Lugias as well as the Rapid Strike boxes. So there is reason for Arc to see play because at least it's coming to challenge Turbo and Kyogre Lost Box because these are some of the best performing decks in the last few weeks. Charizard is still worried about that Rapid Strike matchup, also a little bit worried about Chien-Pao and Giratina. I would say Giratina's on the down low. But possibly there's a reason for it to be coming back if Arcs are getting big enough in the meta. We probably need to see evidence of Arceus resurfacing in IRL play before we start committing down that Giratina Lost Zone box train again. But it does at least prey on the Charizards fairly well. For Chien-Pao, its biggest enemy is typically itself, but it's also not that great into the Lost Zone matchup, and also isn't that good into the Mew matchup either. I expect just DTE, Mew, Grabber, Luxray is just a horrible combo for Chien-Pao to come up against. You will almost always brick them because they have such specific hands, and then you can just pick apart their board from there. Honestly, Gardevoir is looking more and more well-rounded as we look at the sort of top decks in the game right now. Chien-Pao is a concern, but you do have maneuverability around them, and they're one of the lesser consistent decks in the game. Surprisingly, Lost Zone Box isn't even showing as a negative matchup. I know there has been murmurings of League HQ. I know Henry Brand played it in the previous regional championships, and we keep seeing very high-level pilots of Gardevoir going deep in tournaments. It just seems to be a very solid deck in the game right now. Definitely not one that anyone's necessarily disrespecting, but it seems to be in a pretty good spot right now. Giratina is still seeing more play in the online spaces than IRL. It seems very weak into the colourless Lugias, and surprisingly it struggled into some of these Arc piles. I thought that would have been one of your better matchups, but beyond those, it still has another few 40%ers in here, with Lost Zone Box not being that favourable, still the Rapid Strike deck not being all that positive. I feel like the meta still might have to shift more favourably for Tina for it to make a comeback, more Arc decks popping up, more Charizard in the meta, that sort of thing, for me to feel super confident playing Giratina. Or there would have to be a shift in deck list and mentality, possibly seeing things like Snorlax coming back into the deck list, trimming down a Tina count just to like a 2-2 line, so you can still have that high damage output threshold, but you only really put 1-2 prize Pokemon into play at any point in any game, and hope that that can carry 4 prize cards in certain situations. I think that's a more viable strategy for Tina going forward, and it could have to adapt if it wants to stay in the mix. No real news for Rapid Strike. It actually enjoys a small uptick in these Arc builds, but is still having to dodge the wave of Lugia, which did very well at the previous regional, as well as the Mew VMAX with Grabber, which still seems to have some life left in it. Those are the main things trying to dodge as Rapid Box. I already mentioned when talking about Arceus that the Lost Zone Box does have to dodge that matchup, but also isn't too pleased with the colourless Lugias. Even the Kyogre builds struggle into colourless Lugia from my testing this week, as well as the Mew matchup also being far from ideal because so many Lost Zone Box players are choosing to cut Drapion for some reason. I feel like if you instantly put it back into your deck list, you flip that matchup, which would be great, but you're still just close into a number of other matchups. The Charizard isn't the easiest for you, and it seems like Gardevoir is still proven to be a challenge. Colourless Lugia seems very good into so many decks. It's literally just Arc, Mew, and Miraidon, the path decks, which all seem to be problematic for you, but also Charizard seems to be somewhat of an issue as well, where they just have such high hit points, and because they're cherry picking the bosses and the Ionos as and when they need them, they should have a decent time into the Lugia matchup. Mew is looking better and better by the day, and trust me, I think this is actually a really big week for Mew, because Charizard once again failed to convert into a top 8 in the second regional of this format, which makes me think that percentage could be decreasing. Charizard could be below 10% going into the Lille Regional, so I think it's not yet time to take out your Drapions or your Spiritooms. I'm personally going to be respecting Mew this weekend, and I feel like most players should be doing the same thing, because the grabber build is having good results in the online space, and when your worst matchups are Arceus, which who knows how much of that's going to show up, Charizard, where you're already teching for it if you are playing the Rowan build, and Guardy is still a sub 50% with a DTE base build, but with Hand Disruption and Path, you always are in with a shot. I feel like there is just so many reasons to still like Mew going into this format. At the end, then we have Miraidon, doesn't appreciate the Rapid Strike matchup or the Mew matchup, also doesn't really like the Lost Zone box matchup, but it's consistent, it's fast, it gets into most games, and it's going to do those checkpoints of trying to throw Judge and Path at your opponent as well. So you're pressurizing early prize cards to deplete weak board states. You're trying to catch people on weak hands with Judge and Path throughout the game. You have one-hit KO potential, you have beatdown potential. I feel like the deck is still fairly solid in the game, and even though it was kind of overinflated in Sacramento, I still feel like it could show up in a decent number this weekend. My main question marks going into Lille then is how confident are players actually going to be jumping shit from whatever they were testing onto some arc piles, because that has been the sort of talk of this week, where so many different variations have been doing well in the online space, and of course it got the second place. I'm also kind of interested in Charizard. It feels like it shouldn't really be fading into obscurity, even though it has failed to convert in a number of regionals, even with really high play rate. And I'm still always concerned about Mew, because whenever you look at this graphic, Mew is looking very, very powerful, and that's with people still playing Spiritomb in some of these lists as well. You never really know online who's teching for what, so I'm certain there will be a percentage of people who are respecting the Mew matchup, and it's still getting the job done so consistently in so many matchups. Still a terrifying archetype, and is still finding the way to go deep in tournaments. Let me know your thoughts down below. What do you make of some of those crazy arc piles? Which was your favourite of those that we saw today? And yeah, I'm going to be shipping out to Lille in a couple of days, so wish me luck, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.